The 2008 season was uniquely shaped by current events.
What started in America last year has now spread to every part of the world.
We're down 9% today. The Zetrodax over in Frankfurt is down by 9%. The Paris market down by 9%. Austria, which was briefly suspended earlier on in the day, is down by nearly 11%.
Naturally, its reach made its mark on the most expensive traveling circus on planet Earth, Formula One. Cost-cutting procedures were put into place to combat the effects of the financial crisis, which crippled many industries. On top of that, major changes were instituted to improve the aerodynamics of the cars. Changes like the introduction of the Kerr system, slick tires, a taller rear wing setup that was more narrow, while simultaneously dropping the front wings down and widening them out. These, along with a few others, are meant to make overtaking a more common occurrence. F1 as a business was surely to be hurt, but so were the teams individually, none more so than Honda. The financial collapse brought the automotive industry to its knees, with Honda fully immersed in damage control. They were forced to suddenly pull out of Formula One late in 2008, just as the grid was forming for the 2009 season. They had two experienced drivers ready to race in a highly developed car. The team, led by Brawn, scrambled furiously to put Rubens Barrichello and Jenson Button on the grid. Months went by. The team and the factory waited to learn if they had jobs or not, let alone be building a race-winning car. It wasn't until March of 2009 that Brawn GP was formalized after an MBO saw Brawn and Nick Fry take over the team. The Honda RA109 became the BGP 001. Leading up to that season, the Honda team was on a string of poor performance. They had 6 points with 3 in the points finishes in 2007, and 14 points from 4 in the points finishes, including 1 podium at Silverstone in 2008. After taking 8 constructors titles already in his career, the expectations were high. The poor results that he was walking into were all the more reason to focus to shift towards the impending regulations that were set to shake up the grid. Having buried so much into the car, Brawn was keenly aware of the performance it was capable of, but after Honda's exit, they naturally were left without an engine. The newly branded Brawn GP opted for the Mercedes engine. Having taken Mercedes up on their engine deal, they didn't have much time to adapt the car to that new engine. They also chose to forego Kerr's. Honda was originally slated to be one of the first teams to actually use the system, but Brawn didn't have enough time and they thought it'd be best to focus on aerodynamics. So by the time we get to winter testing and everyone's talking about Brawn and their story, well, that makes sense, but not for that reason. Everyone is talking about Brawn because of one critical element: the double diffuser. At that point in the season, 3 cars were identified to be using this quote-unquote double diffuser: the Williams FW31, the Toyota TF109, and the Brawn BGP 001. The rear diffusers, or as they were called, the double diffusers, were protested by the 7 other teams. The system leveraged the rear crash structure as a means for incremental downforce. The official protest over the double diffusers was launched on the race week of the opening round, which is exactly where we pick up the action. Round 1, Australia. The Brawn team had already impressed most of the grid as they were at the top of the sheets in testing. But when Jenson Button and Rubens Barrichello led every session and took a front row lockout with Button on pole, it was confirmed the pace was real and they had the edge. And while it was the perfect start of the season, Barrichello's start of the race was less than perfect. This was one of many incidents throughout the race that would ultimately lead to what was at the time the second ever finish under a safety car. The other notable collision was Sebastian Vettel and Robert Kubica. After the two touched, both continued on, but suffered from their loss of downforce. Vettel would be considered in the wrong, as well as being fined for carrying on at the end of the race, seeing as how he was still in the points. Red Bull's woes would continue despite having one of the best cars on the grid, as Webber would be the only car of the field to be lapped. The other notable incident was between Jarno Trulli and Lewis Hamilton. Trulli was accused of passing under the safety car that was brought out after Vettel's debris was unable to be cleared with enough time. Initially, Trulli was found to have breached Article 40.14 of the 2009 sporting regulation. He was given a firm 25-second penalty. A deeper investigation later overturned the initial ruling, and Trulli would eventually have his podium reinstated. It was confirmed that McLaren had ordered Hamilton to let Trulli by, consistent with the Italian's initial defense as well as Hamilton's initial comments, but it was revealed Hamilton and McLaren conveyed a different message to stewards later, which led to Trulli's infraction. It was deemed that Lewis Hamilton had misled stewards and he was disqualified from the race. Meanwhile, Barrichello may have fluffed his start. He recovered beautifully and would get his highest points finish since the controversial 2005 US Grand Prix. The Brawn GP team converted their front row lockout to a 1-2 finish. A rookie team hasn't accomplished this feat in over half a century. The last occurrence was the great Fangio's win at the Mercedes debut outing in the 1954 French Grand Prix. Ross Brawn, after the win, was quoted as saying, "After everything that our team has been through over the past 4 months, this is quite simply a sensational result." The results after round 1 have Button and Barrichello in first and second, of course, Trulli, Glock, followed by Alonso in the Drivers' Championship. Round 2, Malaysia. Button would continue on with the pace he showed in round 1 and be joined on the front row by Trulli. After a poor start, Button made up the places he had initially lost, as both Toyota drivers would get the conditions just right and continue their impressive start to the season, remaining at the top of the field. Trulli especially nailed down the intermediates, and many would follow suit. The rain would begin on lap 19, but the race would not be officially called off until lap 33. Thanks to his early recovery, Jenson Button would convert another pole into another race win. This would mark the second time in history a new constructor would win its first 2 consecutive Grand Prix. The other rarity would be that the grid would receive half points for just the 5th time in Formula 1 history. The results after round 2 in Malaysia had Button retain his lead with Barrichello just behind him. Trulli, Glock, and Nick Heidfeld now was in 5th place. The Chinese Grand Prix would be the first time that Brawn would be absent from the top 3 after qualifying, as the Red Bull pair would be split by Fernando Alonso. The rain would continue to make the race weekends difficult for the drivers, as the race would start under safety car for the first 8 laps. The poor conditions would remain and lead to a number of errors and incidents. In the end, Red Bull would finish 1-2 as Vettel did his best to slow down the Brawn dominance. Webber also achieved his best result of his career at P2. Though Red Bull took maximum points, Button would not be denied a podium, as he finished P3 with his teammate Barrichello just behind him. In the Drivers' Championship, Button and Barrichello lead, with now Vettel, who jumped up to 3rd place, tied with Glock and Webber at 9.5 points. The Constructors' Championship sees a surge from Red Bull after taking maximum points to 19.5, just ahead of Toyota at 18.5, McLaren and BMW follow at 8 and 4 points respectively. Round 4, Bahrain. The weekend began beautifully for the Toyotas of Trulli and Glock as they locked out the front row. Poor pit strategy, though, would place them behind Button, where they would stay for the duration of the race. Sebastian Vettel would actually improve his position by 1 and move up to P2. Jenson would go on to win his 3rd race of the season. Trulli would convert his pole to a 3rd place, rounding out the podium. Ferrari broke their streak of failing to finish in the points as Kimi grabbed 3 points for his P6 efforts after starting P10 on the grid. The Scuderia start was eerily similar to their season following their 1979 double, where it took 4 races to score a single point. And while it appeared that they had staved off having one of the worst starts in history, they still were way off the pace, and this was not a good sign to come, as we'll see. Trulli and Glock continue to impress as they take advantage of the fact that McLaren is nowhere to be found. They've had a noticeably poor start to the season. Vettel is now just a single point behind Barrichello. Brawn's 50 points now put them nearly double the points of Red Bull and Toyota at 27.5 and 26.5. McLaren and Renault still follow at 13 and 5. The introduction of the European stretch of the 2009 Formula 1 Championship saw Monaco and Spain, and also upgrade packages. But no matter what other teams threw at them, they were no match for Brawn, and especially Button. What we have not seen, though, is the Red Bull iteration of the double diffuser. Even if it was delayed or they didn't bring it, Vettel was still challenging for wins, with or without the double diffuser. So if I were Jenson, I would not get too comfortable. But Button kept on the throttle, and he kept on the race wins as he took another win, taking a commanding lead in the championship at the Monaco Grand Prix. He was now 16 points clear after his back-to-back wins, and the Brit was in rare air as he recorded the 3rd best start in history at the time through 6 races, notching 5 wins and a P3. This was only outdone by Nigel Mansell in his 1992 FW14B and Michael Schumacher in his 1994 B194. He did all this with a single engine, though. More importantly, Brawn was still getting 1-2 finishes, now with their 2nd consecutive. Now they were officially 2 times clear the nearest constructor. Other constructors would go on to get good news as Kimi would finally give Ferrari their first podium of the season in Monaco. Round 7. Turkey. The Turkish Grand Prix is where we begin to see the RB5 start to gain some ground, as Vettel would claim pole, leading all 3 parts of the qualifying session. The 2 Brawn cars would come next, with Mark Webber in 4th place joining Rubens Barrichello on the 2nd row. We'd see action immediately at the start of the race as Button would capitalize on a mistake from Vettel and take the lead position. Barrichello again would have an issue with his start as he encountered another problem, this time with the clutch. Webber would then move up into 2nd position behind Button with Vettel in P3, which is how the race would end. Jenson would now be only the 5th driver in history to win 6 of 7 races. He He would join the likes of Ascari, Fangio, Clark, and Schumacher. Unsurprisingly, all of these drivers would go on to win the driver's title. And as if McLaren would need any more proof that their car was not where it should be, Hamilton, the reigning world champion, was lapped by Brawn. This was clear. It was not the strongest McLaren ever designed. Hamilton and Kovalainen would finish P13 and P14 respectively. Round 8. Silverstone. As on-track action intensified, off-track chatter was growing louder as the conflict between the FIA, Formula One Teams Association, and Formula One management was intensifying. At this point, the 2010 budget cap was increasingly becoming more and more of a sticking point as the breakaway talks were becoming more substantial. Max Mosley, head of the FIA at the time, was confident that the teams were going to be able to reach an agreement and they'd be racing next season. But we've still got this season to worry about. On track, Red Bull would continue to be strong as they brought substantial upgrades to the track, which resulted in Vettel on pole and Webber in third, split by Barrichello. Vettel would convert his pole into a race win, and Webber would move up a position to give Red Bull a 1-2 finish. Barrichello would complete the third spot on the podium. Ferrari at this point are just becoming an afterthought, but they would take 6 points as Felipe Massa finished P4 and his teammate Raikkonen finished P8. Rosberg drove an impressive 5th place finish as Button would have his worst race of the season thus far, at P6. Adding insult to injury, Hamilton would again be lapped, finishing his home race in 16th place. The Constructors' Championship is beginning to tighten up a bit. Brawn sit at 105 points, with Red Bull at 74.5, Toyota at 34.5, Ferrari trail them at 26, with McLaren at 15.5. Round 9. Germany. The last few races, we've seen glimpses of what the Red Bull can do. At Germany, we're going to see the real pace, as their upgrade packages are proving that they're effective. Another Red Bull would dominate the weekend, but this time it would be Mark Webber's. He took a highly contested pole. Both Brawn cars would be hot on his heels, following him closely. Ultimately, Vettel would be on the second row with Jensen, and both McLaren paired on the third row. The start of the race saw a bit of early clashing with wheels touching, but despite some of this, Webber would recover and ultimately win the Grand Prix, separated by nearly 10 seconds from Vettel. Red Bull crucially earned another 1-2 finish, as Massa and Rosberg displaced the thus far dominant Brawn duo in P3 and P4 respectively. Button and Barrichello would finish ahead of Alonso in P7 as Kovalainen grabbed the last point in P8, his teammate Lewis Hamilton falling back to dead last as he was dealing with an early puncture. In the Drivers' Championship, both Red Bull drivers would jump Brawn's Barrichello, relegating the Brazilian to P4. Despite the tremendously successful Brawn cars, Red Bull continued to put the pressure on, and they cut the gap to under 20 points, as Brawn sat at 112 versus Red Bull's 92.5. Toyota was still at 34.5 with Ferrari at 32, and now Williams took the 5th place spot at 20.5 points. Round 10. Hungary. As if Ferrari's luck couldn't get any worse, the weekend began on a somber note, with Felipe Massa having a very serious incident in the qualifying session. The Brazilian was knocked unconscious with his foot still even on the throttle as he lodged his Ferrari into the barrier. The culprit appeared to be a piece of debris that fell off of Barrichello's suspension that struck him in the helmet. The race weekend continued, as did the battle, as Alonso and Vettel would go on to start in the front row, with Webber and Hamilton filling out row 2. More details emerged, and Massa would not return for the session, or for the race for that matter, so all the drivers outside of his initial P10 start moved up 1 spot. After Alonso's beautiful pole lap, he unfortunately had to retire from the race. He wound up losing a wheel, making it back to the pits with just 3, and upon trying to get back to racing, a fuel pump issue ended his day. Vettel would too be forced to retire the car. As a result, Hamilton would run away with the race and win his first Grand Prix of the season, and his first since the 2008 Chinese Grand Prix. Kimi would be the runner-up, with Webber taking 6 points to complete the podium. Nico Rosberg would move up a position and continue his very quiet but very impressive season thus far, finishing P4, while Button would finish a lowly P7 and Barrichello would finish out of the points in P10. Taking a look at the Drivers' Championship, Webber and Vettel would swap places. Rosberg's efforts would slide him up into the 5th slot of the championship. Massa would eventually make a full recovery from that incident, but he was diagnosed with a skull fracture and forced to sit out the remainder of the season. In the Constructors' Championship, Red Bull would inch closer and closer to Brawn at 114 versus Red Bull's 98.5. Ferrari was still more than double away from the Red Bull tally at 40. Toyota was just behind Ferrari, and McLaren were trying to do their best to make their way back into the championship at 28. Round 11. Valencia. The grid would head to Valencia for the European Grand Prix. Romain Grosjean would officially replace Nelson Piquet Jr. after he was released from Renault. This would officially kick off a swirl of controversy. We were still months away from that actually boiling over though. Red Bull showed signs of slowing thanks to the heat, and they were way down in the pace in practice sessions. Brawn would lead the first 2 parts of the qualifying, and then the reigning world champion would step in and take pole position. The second McLaren driver would join Hamilton on the front row, as Barrichello was just ahead of a surprise 4th place finish with Sebastian Vettel, who had engine problems from the heat, but overcame that for a second row start. As the heat persisted, it was pretty clear that the Brawn car seemed to be better suited, but Button's P5 start left him in a difficult place, needing to get around Sebastian Vettel. This would turn out to be an especially difficult day for Jensen, who had a poor start already, but this wouldn't be the day for the drivers at the top of the championship battle. Consistent with the practice sessions, the Red Bulls were not a threat in the race, and Vettel would see his engine nightmare come to fruition as he had an engine issue on lap 23, forcing him to retire. Webber was also unable to add to the team's tally as he finished in P9. Barrichello was the star of the show as he overtook Hamilton in the pits and was helped by a pit error from Hamilton's team not having his tires out of the blankets. Barrichello took P1 and would go on to defend his lead through the race and take much needed points for himself and for the team. Brawn extended over Red Bull and Barrichello put himself back into the fight, capitalizing on the Red Bull's woes. He jumped both Vettel and Webber in the Drivers' Championship to take back P2, trailing his teammate by 18 points now. Hamilton and Raikkonen both earned another podium, finishing P2 and P3 respectively. The grid would conclude the European Tour at Spa and then at Monza. That season's Belgian Grand Prix would see Fisichella start on pole. A first lap incident would take out Hamilton and Button. Barrichello would lose 3 positions during the race, and Webber was handed a costly drive-through penalty for an unsafe release. Raikkonen would put on a masterclass and go on a tear, moving up from P6 all the way up to race leader and ultimately take the victory. Fisichella would only drop 1 place and finish P2, with Vettel just behind him. This put Sebastian within 3 points behind Barrichello and Kimi now in 5th place. Monza would see a return to form of the Brawn GP team, and it would be a crucial one in their title hunt. They were helped by some misfortunes from the other competitors, but also they had a solid performance of their own, taking their 4th 1-2 finish of the season. Despite starting 5th and 6th, their one-stop strategy helped them cruise to a victory. Hamilton's 2-stop strategy had him stuck behind Button in P2 and Barrichello leading into the closing stages of the race. He went off track and started spilling debris, which brought out the safety car, which was unable to catch Barrichello, who crossed the line for Brawn GP for the 8th time that season in 1st place. Hamilton's wreck officially knocked him out of contention for the title. He was joined by Kimi Raikkonen, who was now mathematically eliminated from the hunt. We head to the Singapore Grand Prix, which ended up being the first race all season that a Red Bull nor Brawn was found on the podium. The race would start with Hamilton, Vettel, and Rosberg all leading. The McLaren began to see a turnaround in the car, and the performance was getting better. Hamilton would successfully hold on to his advantage and convert his pole into a victory. Glock's Toyota would be P2, and Alonso completed the podium and went on to dedicate his achievement to Flavio Briatore on the 1-year anniversary of Crashgate. After Nelson Piquet was dismissed a few races ago and Romain Grosjean replaced him, the events of that race in 2008 had come to light and had been escalated all the way up to the World Motorsport Council, which would be heard the weekend prior to the Singapore Grand Prix. And don't forget, if you want to see the action and all the controversy from that race, you can click the eye in the top right corner. With only 3 Grand Prix remaining, there are only 3 drivers who can possibly win the championship. Jenson Button is chief among them at 84 points, with Rubens Barrichello at 69 points and Sebastian Vettel at 59 points. Webber and Raikkonen are both out of contention, but they are in the top 5. Brawn still leads the Constructors' Championship at 153 versus Red Bull's 110.5. Ferrari are just 3 points ahead of McLaren, and that battle would go down to the wire, with Toyota bringing up the rear at 46.5 points. Round 15. Japan. With the Drivers' Championship down to 3, it's all about who can make the least amount of mistakes. At least that's how Button was looking at this, the man who had only used 1 chassis thus far the entire season. But Sebastian Vettel was not out just yet. He would take pole position and his teammate would start from pit lane after a chassis change. Trulli and Hamilton would take the final 3 spots in the qualifying session, and Sebastian would essentially lead start to finish with only a handful of challenging moments on the opening lap. The top 3 starters would also end that way onto a podium finish, with Kimi and Nico Rosberg finishing P4 and P5. The Brawn cars would not have the best of days, and they would take the final 2 points positions. Unfortunately for Webber, he would be a regular in the pits, going 3 separate occasions on 4 laps alone. After the Japanese Grand Prix, Jensen was now 14 points clear of Barrichello and 16 points clear of Vettel. It was exactly the race that Sebastian Vettel needed. He was now 2 points behind Barrichello at 71 versus 69 points. Seb's finish had cut into the Constructors' Championship lead that Brawn was enjoying, but Webber's day didn't help. Ferrari maintained their very marginal lead in 3rd place at 67 versus McLaren 65, and Toyota now at 54.5 points. Round 16, Brazil. A moment that would have been truly magical for Barrichello if he could seize it. A win would inevitably set him up for a more dramatic conclusion in Abu Dhabi, the final round of the season. Button simply had to limit mistakes, and Vettel had to win or be runner-up to remain in the championship fight. But this is Interlagos. Nothing goes to plan. The qualifying session was chaos. It was the first time that almost every team, 9 out of 10, had representation in the knockout stage of the qualifying session. Williams was the only team that would put both drivers through to the final round. Of those left in the title fight, Vettel was knocked out of Q1 and Button out of Q2. And as if you couldn't write the drama, Barrichello in Brazil would go on to take pole just when he needed it the most. Button would start P14 and Sebastian Vettel a lowly P16. Everything seemed in order and in line directly for Barrichello to capitalize. The first lap incident saw Adrian Sutil and truly mix it up, but the incident would lead to both of them retiring from the race. The safety car would be deployed after further damage from that incident. Sutil would now collect Alonso and in both of their races. These incidents all the while allowing the likes of Button and Vettel to improve up the field. The former was now in P9 after the end of the first lap. Vettel himself successfully evaded damage after almost making contact with Kovalainen, an incident for which Kovalainen would need to pit for. His team would end up releasing him from the pit box with the fuel still attached. Raikkonen, who was also in the pits, lights up the fuel trail for good measure and to give Brazil a good show and fireworks. As many of the drivers crucially switched over to a one-stop strategy, Barrichello's pace began to slow and Webber began to pull away. Webber would control the rest of the race and take the victory. Kubica would make a return to the podium, finishing P2 and was joined by Hamilton in P3. But Jenson Button had done enough, and his 5th place finish helped him secure the Drivers' World Championship. And while Barrichello wasn't able to convert that pole in front of his home crowd into a race win, he was able to get P8. Combined with Button's P5 finish, they secured the Constructors' Championship. And just like that, they had done the impossible, the team that was staring down the abyss and came back like a phoenix rising from the ashes to take both titles. But just because the titles were clinched doesn't mean the championship had come to a conclusion. Vettel still needed to protect his P2 honors that he just earned after the Brazilian Grand Prix. Heading into the final round of the 2009 season, he was just 2 points ahead of Barrichello, 74 versus 72. Webber and Hamilton, both out of contention, were now in P4 and P5 in the Drivers' Championship. The other title fight to watch was what was building up in the 3rd place spot with McLaren and Ferrari. McLaren now just a single point ahead of Ferrari at 71 versus 70. And that's where we stand heading into the final round. The early sessions looked like they belonged to Red Bull and McLaren, specifically Hamilton. And as the practice session came to a close, the qualifying sessions were led by Hamilton every single session. Hamilton would go on to clinch a pole position and followed closely by Sebastian Vettel. Webber would be starting next to Barrichello and Button rounding out the top 5. The race was relatively clean with not many incidents. And while Hamilton did get off to a good start and an early lead, it wasn't exactly the dominance we had seen throughout the other sessions. Vettel kept close, and close enough that he would overtake him in the pits and position himself well, but it would never get that far. And unfortunately for the reigning world champion, he would end up being forced to retire from the race with his car reading an error in the right rear brake. Vettel would go on to finish the race 17 seconds ahead of the next car, which was his teammate, Mark Webber, making that Red Bull's 4th 1-2 finish of the season. After a fierce final lap battle, Button would be forced to settle for P3 in the race, but his driver's title still firmly intact. Barrichello's P5 would officially cement his place in 3rd in the Drivers' Championship. And remarkably, Sebastian Vettel's comeback was not good enough for a championship, but it was good enough to split the Brawn duo in P2 in the Drivers' Championship. And despite McLaren's late misfortunes with Hamilton forced to retire, they would hold on to the 3rd place in the Constructors' Championship, just 1 point ahead of Ferrari. The 2009 season saw highs, lows, and firsts. It gave us controversies, thrills, it kept us guessing, proving F1 Elite can lose. But more than anything, it gave us hope that F1 glory isn't reserved just for a couple of teams. Formula 1 may experience periods where it appears that there is no hope for a shakeup. But then, the Brawns happen, and they show us that F1 Elite can be reclassified. And while the world was celebrating the Cinderella story that was the Brawn GP team, F1's next champion was lurking, waiting for his next chance to strike. But just how good will the young German be? We'll soon find out. If you want to check out the action from the 2010 season, I've actually made that season review. You can see that in the eye in the top right corner, as well as the 2012 season review. If you like this video, subscribe and hit the bell notification if I earned it. More than anything, it helps tell YouTube that this channel is worth recommending to other F1 fans. But the best way you can really help out if you want to contribute to the channel's growth is just share the videos on your socials. And lastly, head over to the video suggestion page where you can submit your own request for a video or upvote other ideas that are existing. That way I can make the videos that you all want to see. You can get the link to that forum down in the description below. Thank you for your time as always, and I'll see you very, very soon.